Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. Today, we're going back to the Roaring Twenties. Glitz, glamour, and, as we'll see, some pretty dark secrets. The
Yeah.
sources you found on the Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle case are fascinating, and honestly, it seems like there's a lot more to this story than just a Hollywood scandal.
It's interesting how much this case relies on the narrative surrounding it. Arbuckle, a huge comedic star at the time, was right at the center of a storm, and how the story was told by the press, witnesses, even those close to him, played a huge role in how the public saw him.
Okay, so what do we know? Arbuckle was at the height of his career, right? $1 million a year back then. That's like comedy king money. Then boom, this Labor Day party in 1921 at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco changes everything.
That party is the key to this whole case. Suite 1219 at the St. Francis, it all went down there, and it would ruin Arbuckle's image forever. What makes this case so captivating, even after all these years, is that it makes us look past the headlines and really get into the complexities of what happened.
And it all revolves around Virginia Rappe, an aspiring actress who tragically died after getting sick at that party. It's her story, what she went through, that we really need to focus on.
You're absolutely right. And that's where things get a little complicated. Here's a young woman trying to make it in Hollywood, attending a party thrown by, one of the biggest stars of the day. But what happened in that room? It's shrouded in all these conflicting accounts. It's hard to figure out what's true.
From what I'm reading, the party itself was quite an event. Hollywood personalities, lots of booze, maybe even some, let's say, interesting activities like skinny dipping in the bathtub.
It was definitely not your average party. And those details, the atmosphere, all the drinking, that all fed into the story that got built around Arbuckle. The press, they love a good scandal, and they grabbed those details and ran with them. They painted this picture of a really wild, out-of-control Hollywood party scene.
So even before any accusations came out, they were setting the stage for a huge public drama. The image of Arbuckle, this larger-than-life comedian at this crazy party, the Roaring Twenties in full swing, it's like the story wrote itself.
Exactly. And we need to understand how Arbuckle was already being portrayed, affected how people saw what he did, and ultimately how they saw the events leading to Virginia Rappe's death.
Okay, so we have this party, we have this tragic death, and we have the media all ready for a scandal. What exactly was Arbuckle accused of?
He was accused of manslaughter. It was Maud Delmont, a friend who went to the party with Rappe, who first pointed the finger at Arbuckle. She said he was drunk, aggressive, and that he assaulted Rappe, which led to her injuries and ultimately her death.
But hold on, I'm seeing here that Arbuckle had a totally different story. He claimed that Rappe was already drunk when she arrived, that he found her sick in his room and tried to help her. It's like two completely different movies going on at the same time.
Yeah, and that's the core of this whole mystery. You've got these competing stories. Arbuckle is saying he's innocent, just trying to help someone who is in trouble. And then you have Delmont, who is saying he's this reckless, violent person who is responsible for Rappe's death.
So how do we even start to figure this out? Were there other people at the party? Did anyone else see what happened to Rappe?
There were witnesses, but their stories, well, they're all over the place. Some backed up Arbuckle's story, saying that Rappe was definitely drunk when she got there. But some said that Arbuckle was being aggressive, which, well, that added to what Delmont was saying.
It's like trying to put a puzzle together when you're missing half the pieces, and the ones you have don't quite fit. It really shows you how hard it is to know the truth when there are so many different viewpoints, so much potential for bias.
And that's exactly what makes this case so interesting. It makes us think critically about how we create these narratives, how we judge evidence, and how we deal with, well, the fact that human memory and perception aren't always that reliable.
All right, so we have this chaotic party, this tragic death, and then all these accusations and conflicting stories. What happened after Rappe collapsed?
Well, after Rappe collapsed, she was taken to another room, and a couple of doctors who were at the party looked at her. But she got worse and was taken to a hospital.
And this is where the story gets even more heartbreaking.
A few days later, Virginia Rappe died. This news, it just shocked everyone. And because Delmont had already been saying all this stuff about Arbuckle, public opinion turned against him really fast.
So this already complicated situation explodes into a full-blown scandal. What happened then? Did the police get involved?
Of course. With everything that had happened and all the public pressure, the police quickly arrested Arbuckle and charged him with manslaughter. This is where the media really took over. They were churning out headlines saying Arbuckle was this depraved, overweight celebrity who took advantage of this young, innocent actress.
Wow, it's amazing how fast public opinion can change. One minute you're a beloved comedian, and the next you're public enemy number one. Makes you think about how fragile fame can be, how easily it can be shattered.
It shows the incredible power of the media, especially back then, before social media and fact-checking. The way they presented the story, the words they used, the pictures they chose, it all shaped how people understood Arbuckle and what they thought he did.
Okay, so we've got the scene, the accusations, and this media frenzy. There's still a lot to unpack, especially about the trial.
You're right. And the trial, well, there were actually three trials. There were those fighting for Arbuckle, saying he was innocent, and those who wanted to see him punished for what they believed he did.
3 trials. Wow, that's intense. This case really captured the attention of the whole country, didn't it? It sounds like we've got a lot to dig into for the next part.
Those trials, they reveal even more about the different versions of events, the questionable evidence, and the huge pressure that everyone was under, from the witnesses to the lawyers to Arbuckle himself.
This is a story that just keeps getting more and more complex. I'm hooked already.
I hear you. There's something about this case, the mix of Hollywood glamour, the tragedy of this young woman's death, and the questions about what really happened that night. It just draws you in.
It reminds you that history is often a lot messier and more complicated than the stories we tell ourselves.
Absolutely. And sometimes, even when the verdict comes in, the search for the truth goes on.
Yeah, it shows you that sometimes even getting justice can turn into a spectacle, and the media has a lot of power to shape what people think and even affect what happens in court.
And speaking of court, you said that Arbuckle had not one, not two, but 3 trials. That's got to be some kind of record, right? What happened in those trials? What were the main points they were fighting over? Yeah, 3 trials is definitely not the usual thing. It tells you how complex this case was. That first trial was a mess. It ended with a hung jury. The prosecution, they really wanted to get a guilty verdict, so they focused a lot on Arbuckle's character. They tried to show him as this morally bad guy, someone who was capable of doing the violence they were saying he did.
So they're basically trying to make the jury dislike him, make them think he was a bad person instead of just looking at the evidence, huh?
Exactly. And this kind of tactic, well, it wasn't unusual back then. In the early 1920s, people were getting more and more worried about Hollywood's influence. They felt like the movie industry didn't have good morals, like the stars were living these crazy lives. And Arbuckle, with his big personality and those comedy roles where he was always eating and getting into trouble, well, he fit right into that idea.
It's like they were trying to make him the example of everything people were scared of about Hollywood. You know, the loose morals, those wild parties, not caring about traditional values. It's almost like they were putting Hollywood itself on trial.
That's a good point. And this fear, this moral panic, it helped the prosecution. They knew if they could paint Arbuckle as a symbol of everything wrong with Hollywood, they could use the public's fear to get that guilty verdict.
So the first trial, hung jury. Must have been super frustrating for both sides.
Yeah.
What about the second trial? Did the prosecution change their strategy?
They actually went even harder. They brought in all these witnesses, and a lot of them, well, their stories didn't match up or they weren't very reliable. One witness, Vaughn, at first she said she saw Arbuckle doing something bad with Rappe, but later she took it back. She said the prosecution had pressured her to say that.
Wow, that's a tangled mess of accusations. You have to wonder how much of what people were saying was because of all the craziness in the media. Did anyone feel like they could actually speak their mind without being afraid of what people would think or what might happen to them?
It's a good question, and it's really important to understanding this whole case. Remember, back then, the media had so much power. They could really control what people thought with those sensational headlines and the way they spun the story.
2 trials, still no verdict. What happened in the third one, the final one? Did they find something, a piece of evidence that finally settled things?
No, not really. What ended up getting Arbuckle acquitted in that third trial was a few things. First, Vaughn, the prosecution's star witness, she just fell apart when the defense lawyers questioned her. She kept changing her story, admitted that she had been influenced by other people. It really hurt the prosecution's case.
So 1 witness down. What else helped Arbuckle?
The defense also went after the medical evidence, which at first seemed to say that Rappe's injuries were from an assault. They brought in experts who said that Rappe might have had a medical problem before, something wrong with her bladder, that might have caused her death.
So they basically created some doubt about how she died, and that made the jury unsure about Arbuckle's guilt.
Right. They shifted the focus away from what Arbuckle might have done and pointed at the possibility that Rappe died for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone else.
So 3 trials, lots of emotions, conflicting stories, evidence that wasn't clear-cut, all this media attention, and finally the jury says not guilty. But Like we've talked about, just because he wasn't found guilty in court didn't mean Arbuckle was really free.
You're right. The damage was already done. All those accusations, the media just going on and on about it, portraying him as this awful person from Hollywood, it all stayed with him. It was a stain that he couldn't get rid of.
It really shows you that sometimes, even when someone is found not guilty, public opinion can be a much harsher judge, and that judgment can last a lot longer.
And in Arbuckle's case, that's exactly what happened. The public turned on him, and even though he was acquitted, movie studios didn't want to hire him. They were afraid of being associated with the scandal. They didn't want to alienate their audiences.
So his career, which was so successful, was over.
Pretty much. Arbuckle, this comedic genius, the highest paid star of his time, became an outcast. The industry that had made him a star turned its back on him. It's a sad story of how quickly you can go from fame to infamy.
And it really makes you think about justice, perception, and how much power the media has to tell the story and shape how we understand events.
It also makes you think about the people who get caught in the middle of these scandals. Virginia Rappe, her life was cut short, and her story often gets lost in the retelling of what happened to Arbuckle.
That's so true. Her story, her experiences, they deserve to be remembered and respected, separate from all the accusations and the media hype that surrounded her death.
Absolutely. When we talk about this case or any case where someone has died, we need to remember to be empathetic and try to understand how complex the human experience really is. Now, there's one more person in this story I think we need to look at a little closer. Maud Delmont, the friend who was with Rappe at the party and the one who first accused Arbuckle.
Delmont. Yeah, you mentioned her earlier. She's the one who said Arbuckle was drunk and aggressive, right?
Yeah. Right. But what's interesting is that Delmont, well, she had a kind of shady past herself. She was known for causing trouble, and there were rumors that she was involved in blackmail schemes.
So she might not have been the most reliable witness. This is starting to sound like a cast of characters straight out of a Hollywood movie. Everyone's got secrets and their own reasons for doing what they do.
Exactly. And trying to figure out those motives, understanding what was really going on behind the scenes, that's what's going to help us get closer to what might have actually happened that night in that hotel room.
Okay, so we have all these complicated relationships, everyone telling different stories, and the media just eating it all up. What happened to Arbuckle after the trials? Did he try to start over, get back into his career?
He did, but he couldn't escape the scandal. Studios were still hesitant to hire him, and the public still saw him as that guy from the headlines.
That must have been really hard, to have your passion, your work, taken away because of accusations that, even though they were proven wrong in court, they still followed him everywhere.
It was a crushing blow, professionally and personally. Arbuckle, who used to be the king of comedy, he was pushed to the sidelines. He became an example of how quickly fame can turn into something bad.
It makes you think about how something like that affects you mentally. To be publicly shamed, to have people say terrible things about you, even after being found not guilty, that kind of thing can be really hard to get over.
And for Arbuckle, it seems like he never really recovered from it. He tried to go back to making movies, directing under a different name, but the scandal was just too much.
So what did he do? Did he just give up on everything?
Not entirely. He eventually went back to his first love, comedy, but this time he was on stage using his real name, Roscoe Arbuckle. It's like he was trying to get his identity back, to separate himself from that fatty persona that had become so connected to the scandal.
That's a pretty powerful statement. Like, he was refusing to let those accusations define who he was. Did he find any peace, any success in those later years?
It's hard to know for sure, but it seems like he found some comfort in going back to his comedic roots, performing on stage, connecting with audiences in a more personal way. He even got a contract with Warner Bros. To direct some short comedies. It wasn't a huge comeback, but it was a comeback.
That's a little bit of hope in a story that's otherwise pretty sad. It shows you that even when things are really tough, even when you've been knocked down and it seems like you're out, people can still find a way to keep going.
It really does. It's about resilience, that ability to pick yourself up and find a way to move forward, even when the world feels like it's against you.
So we've talked about the scandal, the trials, what happened after, and Arbuckle trying to put his life back together. What's the big lesson here? What can we learn from this all these years later?
I think the Arbuckle case is a really strong warning about judging people too quickly, about how sensationalized media stories can do so much damage, and how important it is to have a fair legal process. It's a cautionary tale that's still relevant today, even with social media and news being everywhere all the time.
It makes you think about what justice really means. Is it really justice if someone is found not guilty in court, but everyone still thinks they're guilty? If their life and career are ruined, even though there wasn't enough evidence to convict them?
Those are questions that we still struggle with, not just in Arbuckle's case, but in a lot of other situations where public opinion and what the media says has affected the outcome, even if the legal system says something different.
It reminds us that justice isn't always simple and clear. It's often complicated and can be affected by all sorts of things that happen outside the courtroom.
And that's why it's so important to keep looking back at these cases, to think about them again, to question what we think we know, and to remember that history is rarely a simple story of good guys and bad guys.
So after looking at this from all these angles, all the accusations, the trials, and how much this scandal affected everything, what do we take away from it?
I think we come away with a feeling of, well, caution. Caution about judging too quickly, caution about believing everything we see in the media, and caution about how much damage public opinion can do.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how we get our information these days, with social media and the news being on all the time. Would Arbuckle's story have been different if it happened now?
That's a tough one. I mean, you can't really take a case like this out of its time. The media was a totally different animal back then. But the way public opinion works, how stories can just blow up and get out of control, that's still the same.
Going through all this, there's one thing that really stands out to me. It's Henry Lerman, Virginia's ex-fiancé. He just adds another whole level of weirdness to this whole thing.
Yeah, Lehrman, he's a really interesting character. People don't talk about him much in this case. He was one of the first to come out and trash Arbuckle, saying he was this monster who killed Rappe. But what people forget is that Lehrman himself had a history of being abusive, especially to Rappe.
Wait, really? So this guy, the one leading the charge against Arbuckle, saying he was violent, he was violent himself? That's some kind of messed up irony, isn't it?
It is, and it makes you wonder what his real motives were. Some people have said that Lehrman, who was a director too, saw this whole thing as a chance to take out a rival. Arbuckle was way more successful than him, and maybe this scandal was a way for Lehrman to try and get back some of the status he had lost.
So it wasn't just about getting justice for Rappe, huh? It was about competition, jealousy, maybe even revenge. It's like a Hollywood movie plot, ambition and betrayal leading to someone's downfall.
Yeah, it's got that dramatic feel to it, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got Maud Delmont, who is the one who first accused Arbuckle, but she also had a shady past. Rumors about her being involved in all sorts of stuff, even blackmail.
It's like everyone in this story has their own angle, their own secrets they're hiding. It really makes you see how hard it is to figure out the truth when you've got all these relationships and motives tangled up together.
That's the puzzle, right? Trying to put the pieces together, figuring out who to believe, and trying to get some understanding of the human story behind all the headlines.
This whole case has made me realize how easy it is to judge too quickly, to believe a simple story without thinking about why people are saying what they're saying and whether they're biased or not. It reminds you that even when people are trying to get justice, others can get hurt, collateral damage from how the public reacts.
Arbuckle's story is a perfect example of how, once your reputation is ruined, it's almost impossible to fix it. It also shows how much responsibility we have as people who see and hear all this information to be critical, to think about where it's coming from, and to remember that the truth is often a lot harder to find than we want it to be.
It's a lesson that applies to now, just as much as it did back then. It's about how powerful stories are, how much influence the media has, and how important it is to look at things with empathy, to think critically, and to really want to understand all sides of the story.
Well said.
So from an overweight star to, how can I say this nicely, a well-fed Simon and his partner in Crime Time, Inc., Tom will be talking more about this on their show Sunday. But until then, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.